I am so excited that we're all here and that we have these amazing artists and thinkers and activists with us to talk tonight. This is part two of a series that is called the Spotlight series. We're doing within Jewish Voice for Peace membership. The idea is that each month we feature a different network of JVP members. Last month we had rabbis. This month we're featuring artists, and the next month we'll be doing health workers. And it means that we do a webinar each month and a newsletter. So if you haven't already registered, if you wound up here in this webinar for other reasons or from another source, I encourage you to register for the whole series. It's at jvp.org/spotlight. And if you have any questions about it or thoughts or feedback, I welcome you to reach out to me. I'm Sam. I'm the membership manager on staff at JVP. You can reach me at membership@jvp.org. And both that link and my email address I put in the chat box. So that's all. That's my spiel. I'm going to hand it over to Irit to get us started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arielle. I am a JVP member and artist living in Philadelphia. And I worked with Sam to put this webinar together. And tonight we're going to be listening to a conversation with Arielle Angel and Rosza Daniel Lang Levitsky. And they're going to be discussing Arielle's article, Picturing Power, which was published in Jewish Currents, which Arielle is an editor of. And I hope you had a chance to look at the article, but if you haven't, that's fine. I think we're going to still have a great conversation. Afterwards, after Rosza and Arielle talk for a while, we're going to either stay in a big group or break up into smaller groups and have some conversations together, and we'll get back together as a big group with some follow-up questions and share what we talked about. And before I introduce Arielle and Rosza, I want to let you know a little bit about the history of the JVP Artists Council. And in 2014, there was 36 artists and cultural workers. Rosza was part of that. I was, and a few other folks on this call. And we all came and gathered at the Isabel Friedman Center in Connecticut for an artists and cultural workers retreat, leadership retreat. And we had this incredible weekend together. And after that, with the goal of thinking about how artists and cultural workers can support the work of JVP by offering art and cultural work to both strengthen the organizing and also shape its strategy. And since then, many artists have collaborated and worked together in various ways. And so me and Sam talked about this webinar as a way to open up this discussion of art and cultural work within JVP to members who may or may not identify as artists, but we just really think that Arielle's article was a great jumping off point to start this discussion and think about the role of art in relationship to protest. So I'm just going to turn it over to Arielle and Rosza, and we're just going to listen to them for a little bit, and then we'll all discuss things together. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you guys for that introduction, and thank you all for being on this call. I guess probably the place to start is just with a little bit of a summary of the piece, and for those that haven't read it, and maybe a little refresher for those that have. I want to start maybe by talking about one of the central ideas in the piece, which is about the difference between what I'm calling symbolic action and direct action. So the piece begins with a little vignette about an action that we did following the Pittsburgh massacre in front of the Metropolitan Republican Club in New York City. And we did the action at a moment where nobody, and we chose a time to make it on the nightly news, and we basically performed a desire to be like let inside the club and to disrupt the workings of the club, and then were then arrested, which we knew we would be arrested because we were blocking the doors, which indeed made it on the nightly news and sort of created the kind of media narrative that we were looking for, which was to bring attention to the narrative that that the GOP was allowing white nationalism into the party, and that this was the kind of thing that was causing the anti-Semitic violence. This experience for me didn't quite feel right, basically because I felt that we didn't actually disrupt the Republican Club, and that we were measuring success for the action in terms of how the action was perceived in the media. And I was started to think about basically how often we are organizing essentially for cameras, for optics, and whether or not these actions that are planned for the purposes of media attention actually end up doing the thing that we want them to do, which is actually disruption. So the piece is basically trying to juxtapose that example of what I'm calling symbolic action with the example of the JFK airport protests that took place in January of 2017 when Trump's Muslim ban came into effect, where, you know, kind of immediately all over the country, people were clogging the airports and became, in a sense, unignorable. I talk about kind of the limitations also of that action in the piece. I won't get into that now, but I think that just to start us off, the point, or like in terms of what this has to do with artists or what this has to do with aesthetics, is essentially, as far as I'm concerned, as someone who organized a lot in kind of traditional organizing spaces, but as an artist, and was looking for a way to do like arts activism, a lot of what that meant to me was having to make signs for an action, or having to make a prop for an action. And that was sort of what we were thinking about when we thought about what an action needs on an aesthetic level. And I think what the piece is trying to do on a deeper level is try to think about what are the aesthetic conditions of power. What does power look like? What does it feel like? If a protest is in a way a performance, what are the things common to a performance that make it feel like a powerful experience? So I guess I'll just start there, and maybe give Rosza the opportunity to jump in and build off that a little bit.
I'll unmute myself first. And I'm going to start actually just by saying a couple of words responding to Kathy's question in the chat. So I'm a cultural worker and organizer. I'm a theater person by craft. I do a lot of different kinds of performance, puppetry, dance, more conventional theater. Also a lot of design and build that puts me in the visual realm a fair amount. And also do a fair amount of writing of various kinds. And I've been organizing with one project or another for the last 25 or so years. A lot of Palestine solidarity work, a lot of police and prison abolition work, a fair amount of time in the labor movement at one point, various other things. And so all of those things are coming into, are sort of where I come into thinking about this from. And I think one of the things that I'm excited about Arielle's piece being in circulation about is the distinction between symbolic action and concrete action that she's just laid out, which to me is one of the most important things, because one of the things that I think is very obviously true in the experience of organizing and of participating in movement work, but is very rarely talked about directly, is the ways that the focus on symbolic action is both demobilizing and ineffective. We can see it maybe most obviously in things like the large scale permitted marches, whether we're talking about the most recent climate march in New York, whether we're talking about the perennial let's go to DC on a weekend and walk around the block on whatever subject. And these are things that when they were developed as strategies, they had a very concrete meaning and impact, because what they were was a large group of people who could be rioting and probably recently were rioting, saying, hey, this is what it looks like when we show up and don't do anything in particular. In the absence of concrete action, there is no exertion of power. There is no implied threat. There's no reason for anyone to care. And so the justification for these things has become press. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that, first of all,
media attention. I mean,
yeah. Press meaning not just newspapers, but whatever form of media attention. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the media attention doesn't arrive. It doesn't exist. You can have hundreds of thousands of people in the street, in New York, in DC, wherever, and you might get a few paragraphs on a back page. You're not going to get television media coverage. And in fact, these media channels aren't particularly meaningful in spreading information in the current ways that news happens, that information travels. But to shift back to cultural work side of things, I don't want to be at all dismissive of the demo dressing kinds of things, of giant puppets, of beautiful signs and banners. I spend a lot of time making those things. The question to me is always, where are they seen? What are they communicating to who in their actual physical presence in the world? But when we think about cultural work in demonstration contexts and so on, and in terms of direct action, only in terms of that kind of additive thing, we're missing most of what cultural work can do in a situation of concrete action to have a material impact on the world. For example, I'm thinking, I had 2 or 3 possible examples in my head, and I'm stalled on which one. When we take over a space, whether it's a pharmaceutical company office in the way that ACT UP did many times, whether it's a Israeli consulate anteroom, whether it's the lobby at the Ford Foundation, how we do that is something that can look many different ways and can also be done with our bodies in many different ways. When choreographers and people who go out dancing a lot are who's making those things happen.
Or theater makers who coordinate space, who think about space in that kind of way. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The bodies in space get used in a very different way that's often more effective in maintaining control over those spaces than when it's an unshaped mass, or when it's organizers who are not coming from a cultural work background or space. When ACT UP did office takeovers, they would do a tightening spiral in those spaces, which came from many different kinds of dance floors, many different kinds of dance rituals. What it meant was that the space was densely full of bodies that were hard to remove, and that made it possible for other folks in the action to go into the file cabinets, to look at the Rolodexes, to get the material that the action was there to find and to learn from, as well as to prevent the operation of the office. That's something that comes from cultural work when it's oriented towards concrete effect and direct action.
Yeah, there's like a few things that I would say to jump off of that. One is that often when we do that thing that you've just described, when we do that choreography, when we're kind of aiming for disruption and taking into account kind of the aesthetics of power, as I've been calling it in the piece, we do end up with more powerful images at the end of the day as well. I mean, the image does become this very powerful byproduct, which does have value in the world, because not everyone can be at the action, for example. But we're not aiming for the image. We're creating the actual experience, which actually centers on the experience of the protester themselves. One of the texts that Rosza and I talked about a lot when thinking about this webinar is John Berger's, let me just pull it up quickly, is John Berger's The Nature of Mass Demonstrations. And in that text, he's talking about how demonstrations are basically rehearsals for revolution. And a lot of that is about the experience of the people who are there and their ability to feel powerful and to kind of like expand the possibilities of what feels possible in that space. I think that something else that, Rosza, that you were talking about that I think is really important is just about the structures. Oh yeah, I can put the
I'll put that in the chat while you keep going.
Great. So I think something that is really important that you're talking about is also like the structures that allow artists to do this kind of work. I think that, at least in my experience, in my organizing experience, if you come into a lot of organizing spaces basically saying I'm an artist of one kind or another, I think that the assumption is sort of that somebody else is going to plan the action and that you are going to put the kind of cherry on top on some level, that you're going to kind of dress it up, usually almost exclusively visually, without thinking about like all of the different ways that we experience an action in terms of like through the senses. In the piece, I think I talk a bit about, or I cite extensively from Susan Buckmorse, who talks about how actually part of the role of protest is to sort of awaken the senses and get closer to reality on a certain level. And so when we're thinking about the senses, we're thinking about music, we're thinking about choreography, as Rosza said, we're thinking about all of the ways that we're taking in an action physically. And in order to really engineer this kind of experience to the extent that you can, we can't have structures that relegate artists to you know, a kind of backseat role or like an after the fact kind of role. We need to put people who are thinking in this way in the driver's seat of these actions and allow them to do the visioning.
And to build on that a little bit, I'm going to actually say one thing more directly about that, and then turn back to the idea of street actions as spaces of practice, spaces of rehearsal, spaces of learning. I think what Arielle said about artists' roles and cultural workers' roles in demonstrations also applies to really every area of movement work. That when cultural workers are present as cultural workers and operating from that approach, it has the potential to change how our movements operate. I'm thinking about some of the proposals that came out of the JVP Artists and Cultural Workers Council for national member meetings that weren't adopted in those planning processes, for thinking differently about the physical space of the meeting, of how to have discussions, panels, and so on in ways that were easier on the body by being bodies in motion, by being attentive to the sensory experience of those spaces and of being together. And of ideas like every panel should have a poet. There is always a poet who can speak to whatever the topic is. The question is, who is that person? And then what will the presence of that kind of thinking, that kind of feeling, that kind of analysis do to the conversation as a whole? And a lot of that interlocks with questions of accessibility, questions of access of all kinds, and has to do in a certain way with thinking about the concrete effect of cultural work within movement spaces as well as within the outside world when we're trying to create to create an impact on whoever our political and organizing targets are. And then to come back around to demonstrations and other street actions as spaces of practice, of rehearsal, of learning and skill building. That's something that the FTP formation that decolonized this place has been anchoring in New York City over the past year, has been doing very deliberately. It's been very exciting to see what happens when street actions are constructed with that in mind. For instance, not the last one, but the FTP demonstration before, these have been focused on policing in particular in subways and subway stations, with demands for free public transit and for an end to policing. So actually, no, the more recent one is a better version. The action itself was a mass fare evasion. It was a concrete exertion of power by several thousand people, going from Grand Central Station to Central Brooklyn at rush hour, which meant that gates were opened. People who were not part of the demonstration were able to have free access to the subway. People who were part of the demonstration, who knew they were going to be part of the demonstration, were able to have the experience of, this is what we can do together with this number of people, and the concrete experience of, this is what a subway station feels like when you don't have to pay, when public transit is seen as a necessity, a right, something that can just be part of our lives. And to do that with a certain degree of protection from the policing that is constant in the New York City subway system.
Oh, go ahead.
The explicit direction in the lead up to the action, was also very much about prepare yourself for a learning experience. White folks, be ready to be on the outsides of the larger groups so that your skin privilege can be a protection. Folks who need care, need protection because of particular vulnerability to policing, whether because of immigration status, because of being queer or trans, etc. Think about how you want to position yourself and see what feels comfortable. Yeah, so a very concrete recent example of what it is when an action thinks of itself as a learning space.
Yeah, as a learning space and a rehearsal. I will quickly respond to Sam's question about something like a Tahrir Square before and then we may actually want to like start breaking into groups so that we also have some time to bring that back. And then if we're going to break into groups, I think Samantha will tell us. But I just wanted to read this one line from The Nature of Mass Demonstration, where he says, "The question which revolutionaries must decide in any given historical situation is whether or not further symbolic rehearsals are necessary. The next stage is training in tactics and strategy for the performance itself." And so I kind of feel like, you know, on some level, like Tahrir Square is like a real revolutionary moment. It may have had sort of small rehearsals that led up to it. I don't really know like the history well enough to know exactly how it started. I don't really, I was paying attention at the time, but not following closely. You know, on some level, there is a measure of differentiation, at least in Berger's framework, between the rehearsals and the moment that has like the true revolutionary potential. And in my piece, I also talk a little bit about how these airport protests kind of felt like they had like the seed of a revolutionary moment, but that they ultimately kind of failed to materialize because for many reasons, because lawyers kind of took over the fight, and therefore we were sort of placated by the idea that people were actually getting through and being reunited. You know, and also because the decentralized nature of some of this organizing meant that people weren't following up in very particular ways. And so I think there is sort of a question here that Rosza and I want to raise that has to do with the nature of or the role that spontaneity plays in this. You know, Rosza was talking about different ways that we create this kind of revolutionary awareness in our demonstrations and in our rehearsals. But there is kind of, I think, a question about how much can you plan to for the revolutionary moment, and how, in some ways, do we bring the kind of aesthetic energy of spontaneity into demonstrations that are indeed planned and created? And I think like that's a question on some level.
And I think just seeing Irene pointing out or specifying that with the Tahrir movement, there was a lot of painstaking neighborhood organizing on a person-to-person level. I think that we also need to be very clear about the difference between the ongoing day-to-day work of organizing and the manifestation of that organizing in actions, which are things that we do to accomplish a specific goal, whether that's making it impossible for the workers at an ICE detention facility to get to work or to leave work, whether that's shutting down the operations of a pharmaceutical company headquarters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are built on organizing. They feed into organizing. When they feel satisfying and successful, they can be an incredible boost to organizing. But they're different from that slow and steady and person-to-person work, in which there's also many important roles for cultural work. That's not what we're talking about so much today. And I guess one thing that I think feels important to mention is the difference that, and I think this is something that Arielle captures really beautifully in the piece, the energizing and mobilizing effect of actions that accomplish concrete things, as opposed to the generally demobilizing effect of symbolic actions, which I think is true on pretty much every scale of action. The difference in energy afterwards between a 1,000-person action that get something done concretely versus one that appears, does its thing for the cameras, and then dissipates, is it's very tangible.
So shall we do, Samantha, would you like to take over in terms of how we're gonna do this next piece?
Yeah. So thank you. This is such a cool discussion to witness. I'm so grateful to both of you for doing this, and you two, Reed, for making this happen. So I am going to break us out into 3 groups. And Irit, Arielle, and Rosza, you'll be in one of you will be in each. And we're just gonna present some discussion questions, and then in about, given where we are on time, let's say like until 50, so 10 till, so that's 13 minutes. And then I'll pull everyone back. So I am going to open the rooms, the breakout rooms. Everybody should see a little alert come up on their screen, and just click something. It should ask you, like, are you ready to go to your breakout room or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it says. And then you'll be whooshed over into a smaller virtual room. And if you're on the phone, you should just go there automatically. So let's try this. Here we go.
Well, should we say the questions first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You want to read the questions first?
Sure. So the questions are, what was an experience of collective action that had the feeling of exerting power? What concretely created that effect on you and the folks that you were with? And which elements of that can be practiced and how? So I actually am going to put that in the chat just so everyone has it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you might want to do it again in your breakout, because I think
Yeah.
once you're in the breakout, you might not be able to see the chat.
Great. Oops. I think I just sent that to only one person, everyone. Hold on. Okay, there we go.
Great. All right, here we go. Rosza, did you see? Oh, there we go. Never mind. There's a few people who still haven't moved over. Ron or Shlomo or Kiali, can you hear me? I'll unmute you.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I need to leave in 5 minutes. One second. Let me do something here.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to leave soon. I'm not sure what is the task.
So I can move you to a breakout room so that you can go for a smaller discussion.
Okay, quick one.
Sure, yeah. You should get something that pops up on your screen.
Yeah, there was something and oh yeah, see, yeah. Okay.
And Kiali, can you hear me? Oh, you can. Did something pop up on your screen? Oh, there you go. Okay, great.
Together, like what it would be like to not pay fare, for instance. So it's not just this sort of idea, but that embodiment, just feels so important. And so that really struck me.
Thanks, Irene. And anyone else want to say what struck them or respond to this idea of practicing for a revolution? And has anyone had that kind of experience at a protest?
Well,
and I see we have a few other folks too, but I guess everyone is being shy.
Hi, I'm in the room now. I just wanted to, I'm popping around to visit everyone.
Hi, Samantha. I think we're kind of stuck here. I don't think anyone's feeling like they actually want to chat.
Oh yeah.
well, I would, but I'm like practicing step back, you know, like I'm usually like in these conversations, I usually have a lot to say. So I just wanted to hear other people, but I'll talk.
Go for it.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, the actions that have been the most powerful is when we've used our bodies clearly, like lying down the street and stopping traffic and making people look, you know, and like, that's usually what I go after, you know, like making people look, making people stop and say, what's going on? What's this about? And so, and I've done that a number of occasions, but, you know,
Could I ask some questions about that?
sure.
So like when you're
I'm driving and
like lying down in the street, right? I mean, like, are these part of big?
Sorry?
Oh, hello, do you hear me?
Yeah,
No.
I just have a bad connection.
Yeah, no, me too.
Okay. Well, so my question is, if when you're doing an action, for example, where you're lying down in the street,
Yeah.
are they like at big actions or small actions? Like, how long are you disrupting traffic? Are you on the move? Can you like get more specific about, like, for example, a specific moment?
Yeah, like, so this was a demonstration that was in response to, you know, in support of Black Lives Matter and
Exactly.
to, like, you know, the killing of brown Black people. So, like, just, and it was mostly white people doing action, taking over a big street, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Boston, but like off of Boston Common, and stopping traffic for as long as people wanted to, you know, just lying down.
And what was the police response?
Basically, the police were surprisingly protective. Yeah. So, and just recently we had another demonstration where they were also, we were moving from one place to another, and there was poetry and discourse, and then we had an action at the end of sending a message to the ADL. But the police actually, you know, we hadn't notified them at all, and they escorted us, you know, so.
Right. So
that was.
It's an interesting thing, right? Because there's sort of this question about, like, you guys were doing a disruptive action where you were actually disrupting the street, right? But the police are essentially escorting you, you know? And on some level, like, you know, I think you have to question, like, is the disruption actually bothering them if they are escorting you, you know? And,
yeah, well, you know, I wasn't I wasn't that interested in bothering the police. I was more, it was like the night before Christmas, it was Hanukkah, and we were actually more disrupting the shoppers. And so they were like, what's going on here, you know?
So in this case, your target was the shoppers.
Yeah, more than the police, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
we did get really, you know, we got front page Globe coverage. So, of course, that made our, you know, the whole demonstration more real than if we hadn't gotten the press, you know. But more, I was interested in talking about using a body, how effective that is.
Yeah, I will also like point out that you said that the press makes the action more real, and I think it can certainly, I can totally see the utility in that and the value in that. And I think part of what I'm trying to posit on some level is that actually the action is what makes the press real, in a certain sense, that like the power of that press, especially in a moment of where we're kind of oversaturated with images and with information, like on some level, it may be actually the other way around, that if we improve the quality of our protests and improve the quality of our disruption, we kind of, first of all, kind of on some level the importance of press to what it is that we're doing. And also we might be also like making, like upping the quality of that interaction by giving better images, by giving kind of like more, a stronger picture for a press or a writer or a photographer to work with. Does anyone else want to jump in the few minutes we have left?
Hey, Arielle.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry I got sidetracked by some dogs a little bit earlier. I heard you talking, couldn't respond. But just a little off topic. 2 years ago, I met a couple. He's Palestinian. His wife is an Israeli Jew. She's from Jerusalem. They're both artists. She's a dancer, ballet dancer, and he's a sculptor. And he does some political. They both lived in, actually, they live in Vienna now. This was back, I guess, after the second Intifada, 2012. After they got married, he wanted to move to Israel with her. He worked in Israel. This is before the second Intifada and before all the Palestinians were kicked out and the wall went up. But he worked as a waiter in a restaurant, lived in a flat with some Israeli guys. So he speaks fluent Hebrew. They got an 8-year-old, 9-year-old girl now, live in Vienna. He has some very interesting artwork. I emailed Samantha links to that. So if you're interested, I can send that to you as well. Sure. And I was hoping, I had sent them, they have a little charity, and I had donated money to them. And they told me they were coming a couple months later. They would be in Texas. His family, his parents and brother and sister live in Texas. So I flew down there and stayed a couple days with them. But very, interesting couple. So I suggested Samantha for next year's meeting, I guess in Philadelphia, or a convention, that maybe there was also a movie, 90-minute movie made by an independent film producer out of Sweden about their life. And it was shown at Tribeca Film Festival. And we'll see if we can maybe show that next year at our conference.
Cool. Maybe you could put the name of the film and the name of the artist in the chat.
Yeah, I can do that. I sent it to her. Let me get it out and I'll forward it on to you.
Okay. Thanks. Well, we
I'll forward it to you privately.
Okay. We will be shuttled back, whooshed back into the group in 30.
Hi to those of you who are coming back to the main room. People have, I think, the next 20 seconds to come back in. So we'll slowly be repopulating the main room for our last 9 minutes of conversation. Once again, when we're in the main room, I'll be muting people besides our speakers, just again, because it's a lot of background noise. So I think we've got most people back. Let's carry on with the final section of the call tonight.
Yeah, so I guess, Rosa, do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
I guess in the time we have left, I just wanted to see if anyone had anything that they wanted to share from their breakouts, or any last questions before we break. And I guess you could put those in the chat, or how does that work, Samantha, if somebody wants to be unmuted to report back from their group?
We can, if you put something in the chat, I can unmute you.
While we're waiting, Arielle, I was just wondering what are some of the responses you got to the article about, I think for some people hearing that like symbolic protests aren't, like to kind of think of them as symbolic, or for them not to be powerful and meaningful, I can imagine can create just a lot of feelings for people. And I was wondering if you could share anything that people mentioned to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like on some level, the piece was responding to a particular strain of organizing that I see a lot related to the group momentum, not the British momentum, but the like organizing group momentum. And a lot of groups organize on this model. So like If Not Now organizes on this model, Cosecha, Dream Defenders, a lot of really great groups who do really, really great work. But are focused on the idea that you target the public, which means that the actions are not actually for, they're not supposed to disrupt the target, they're actually for the public to polarize their opinion and get them to take a stand on an issue. And I actually expected kind of a lot of pushback, just because there are a lot of people organizing on this model. Most of the reactions have been really positive. So I feel like probably like maybe this piece hopefully was written at a moment where people were starting to notice some limitations in their organizing frameworks, that I wasn't the only one who was feeling that way. One like really meaningful response that I got was from kind of a young Marxist organizer who was making a critique of spontaneity, essentially, and talking about more what, which is sort of like, how do you actually practice this? How do you build the practice for this into your organizing, so that you don't have to rely on these spontaneous and like disruptive moments to create that opening? How can you be ready in that moment to push that to the next level, basically?
One thing also that I think is important to say in thinking about the responses to this is that I think to some extent there's a way that the muddiness of the language that the groups that come out of momentum and that model use, to some extent, I think means that some of the folks who this critique is directed at may not register as a critique because they use a language of direct action. But what they mean by that is media stunt. They use a language of disruption. But what they mean by that is a viral image. And I think that part of what's exciting about getting to have this conversation in the JBP space, and also the other conversations in other spaces that are movement spaces following the article, is getting really specific about what we mean when we say concrete action, direct action, what we mean. And I'm seeing Sam in the chat. I've had conversations with people where they clearly didn't get it. I would have thought too concrete to be misunderstood, but yet I've had the actual experience of talking to folks who say direct action, and what they're talking about does not involve any concrete effect on the world, which is odd, but yeah, makes the specificity of the conversations really important.
We should probably wrap up. So maybe if there's just like a final word you'd like to say, any of the three of you, Irit or Rosza or Arielle?
I feel like I've talked a lot. Yeah, I guess like I'll also put a link to this piece and a previous piece about the relationship between art and activism in the chat for people to read. And certainly if you are interested in responding to me, you can get in touch with me through Jewish Currents. You can send anything to editor@jewishcurrents.org. That's where, I see those emails. But yeah.
And I'll say two things by way of wrapping up. One is just to quote Tony K. Bambara, who said the task of the revolutionary artist is to make the revolution irresistible, which to me is both rhymes with, if we're making cultural work just as part of our movement work, the cultural work has to be awesome.
Yeah.
And also that if we're making cultural work in a movement context, the movement work has to be awesome. And the cultural work informing it and suffusing it is one of the things that does that. And the other thing is just to say that a lot of the most exciting movement cultural work that I see around is happening in spaces that aren't marked as movement spaces. It's happening on dance floors, it's happening at poetry reading / dance parties. It's happening in informal spaces of all kinds. And so just to encourage folks to cultivate those spaces, to know those spaces in our neighborhoods, in the places where we live.
And just to jump off of that as a final thought, just putting the experience of the person in the action at the center of that action, not as an afterthought, but also thinking about how it feels for them to be in it, and not of them as just like pawns for this action, so to speak, but really thinking about what you want people to feel and what you want yourself to feel in this moment. I think leading with that on some level.
It's a beautiful note to wrap up on. Thank you so much. This was such an incredible conversation. Again, a huge thank you, Irit, for putting this together. Arielle and Rosza, for your time and your brilliant minds. This is so wonderful. I want to encourage folks, if you are not already plugged into JVP or the artists and cultural work in JVP and you'd like to be, to let me know, and I can do my best to figure out how to get you plugged in. Again, my email is membership@jvp.org. And yeah, I can't thank you three enough. This has been such a great discussion, and I hope we can do more like it.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Take care.